This is Race, Power, and Parent Engagement, the first webinar of this series. My name is Mari Carmen, and I am honored to be moderating tonight's event. On behalf of our team of organizers, I want to welcome you. We are pleased to offer ASL interpretation tonight. If you're having trouble with viewing Joanne, our interpreter, or Rana, our second interpreter, please type in the chat so that our backstage leads can make sure that everyone can see them. So I would like to start by acknowledging the land that we are on. The sacred land on which we stand has been a site of human activity for 15,000 years. The land is the territory of the Huron-Wendat and Petun First Nations, the Anishinaabe, the Seneca, and the Mississaugas of the Credit River. The territory was the subject of the Dish with One Spoon Wampum Belt Covenant, an agreement between the Iroquois Confederacy and the Ojibwe and allied nations to peaceably share and care for the resources around the Great Lakes. Beyond reciting a land acknowledgement, I want to invite everyone to think about what these words mean to each of us, where we are located, both in our complicities and our collective responsibilities, especially today, as the remains of 215 children were discovered in Kamloops Residential School. This horrendous discovery must bring critical interrogations forward. Canada remains a state engaged in an ongoing colonial project of attempting to dispossess Indigenous people of land, resources, and their own culture. As an immigrant mother, I acknowledge the land in which my children are growing. And I am also reminded of the children whose childhoods have been interrupted, and the mothers whose mothering has been injured by the Canadian welfare system as part of an ongoing colonial apparatus that continues to separate families today. A land acknowledgement should not become a move to innocence, but a call to action. And indeed, there are 94 calls to action that were brought forward back in 2015 by the TRC. Tonight, I want to invite everyone who is watching this webinar to go to the document that we're actually going to post on the chat, which is a link to the 94 calls to action. Everyone belongs to an institution, a community, a school, a church. I encourage you to go through the document, become familiar with them, pick one or two, commit to them, bring them to your community. Let us keep this land acknowledgement in mind as we engage in tonight's conversation. So, the format of this session is as follows. There will be two panelists presenting tonight. In between the presentations, I will do a quick intervention where I will be sharing some of my experience. There will be a Q&A at the end where we'll have around 20 minutes for questions. I invite you to submit your questions in advance. You will find the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. Please format your questions as a question and let us know who you are directing them to. They can be directed at both panelists. If you're tweeting or sharing on social media, please use the hashtag #PE4Liberation. You can also follow us on Twitter if you haven't done so, @PE4Liberation. This presentation is being live streamed on YouTube, and it's also going to be recorded. The recording will be shared in a few days. So without further ado, allow me to invite Diana Grimaldos, who is the Parent Ambassador and the Parent Engagement Lead at Working Women Community Center. She's also one of the lead organizers of these webinars. Diana is also a mother of two, a researcher, and a community organizer. I have had the pleasure and the honor of working with Diana for the past months. And so I am delighted to introduce her to do the opening remarks tonight. Welcome, Diana.
Thanks, Mari Carmen. And as we're grieving tonight, we're also reminded of the importance of bringing forward these much needed conversations and the implications of power and how it permeates in our engagement with schools as racialized parents. especially for Indigenous and Black parents whose experiences has been long silenced by colonial education practices, centered on Eurocentric approaches to engagement, and in othering of non-white parents. It is truly an honor to be hosting this webinar tonight and bringing perspectives of parents, caregivers, educators, scholars, and school communities to talk about race, power, and parent engagement as a way to exchange learning, but also unlearnings of navigating the complexity of our education system in Ontario. I am most looking forward to embarking in this conversation, thinking about parent engagement as a liberatory practice that welcomes racialized mothers like me and many who are joining us tonight, and parents and caregivers of colors that shouldn't have to constantly navigate the system, to feel like they belong and that their children will be treated with humanity and care. Over the last year, I have the privilege and the honor to be working alongside Dr. Vidya Shah, who tonight will be sharing the findings of our work and some of the untold stories of parents' experiences and the way in which in the ways of power and whiteness operates against racialized communities and the impact that it has in communities. Over the last 6 years, Working Women Community Center has been offering the Parent Ambassador Program, which I have the pleasure to be leading. The Ambassador Model is a leadership program designed and funded on community care principles, on reflection and action. Our training started with the Latinx community, in which majority were immigrants and newcomers, many of whom have experienced a much different education system, one in which educators had always had their child interests at first, one in which they have not seen as a deficit, but an asset, one in which they never felt unwelcome or told that their English wasn't good enough to participate in a school council meeting. Our training has focused on enhancing parents and caregiver leadership capacity by unpacking the complexities of navigating the education system to meaningfully engage in what engagement can look like for Black, Indigenous, and parents of color. Our training breaks down the understanding of political structures, governance bodies, school councils, power, and decision-making in schooling. This year, we expanded our program, training Black, racialized, immigrants, and newcomers and parents and caregivers. Our training has been designed on an anti-racist approach, where families can explore tools and resources to identify systemic racism and discrimination in schools, learning from educational leaders, advocates, and activists who had shifted the narrative of traditional parent engagement in schools to collective efforts of solidarity. This webinar series is a continuation of the work of the Parent Ambassador Model, building knowledge with communities, for communities, and within communities. It is an honor to be part of this incredible group of tireless advocates to dismantle the inequities in which our education system is built on. Thank you all for being here. Thanks, Irma Villafuerte. Thank you, Vidya from York University, Mari Carmen from Sears, for envisioning this webinar series with us and embarking on this journey of parent engagement for liberation. On behalf of Working Women, I wanted to thank Meridian for supporting us in ESL interpretation for our webinar series. Thanks, Mari Carmen.
Thank you so much for these opening remarks, Diana. And thank you so much for all the work that you do and for the leadership that you have shown. My name is Mari Carmen Lara Villanueva again, and I just want to take a minute to introduce myself. I am a PhD student in the Social Justice Education Department at OISI. My PhD research looks at anti-Black racism in Mexico. However, my previous work explored the complex relations, negotiations, and contestations between white women educators and administrators and non-white mothers. I am also a mother of two and a coordinator at the Center for Integrative Anti-Racism Studies, CIARS. Our organizing team has been working diligently over the past weeks to plan this webinar series. We couldn't do this without the work of Irma Villafuerte, so I want to thank you, Irma, for all the work, for all your work, and also for the support of our volunteers tonight. So on behalf of our team, I want to welcome you again, and I want to thank you for sharing this space with us tonight. So let's get to it. Race, power, and parent engagement. Why is it critical that we engage in issues of race and power, and how these inform our notions and understanding of parent engagement? Something that I have noticed in the past few months is that it became acceptable to engage in certain forms of anti-racism in schools. However, a few years ago, there was a reluctance and a resistance to engage in conversations about race. And we've seen a renewed interest in the past year, which is a good thing. It's a positive thing. I celebrate it. Race is and has always been an inescapable part of classroom and parent-teacher interactions. Today, we know that schools are racially hostile spaces, not only for Black, Indigenous, and racialized students, but also for their families. George Day reminds us that the school system either does something for you or it does something to you. As a parent of two Muslim, Mexican, Pakistani children, I have always been preoccupied with this thought. But also, as a racialized mother working in solidarity with Black, Indigenous, and other racialized mothers, I know that this preoccupation does not only involve my children. Recently, Fiona Lloyd-Henry reminded us in one of our learning circles that she sees Black children, all Black children, as her own. I have learned that these are the logics of Black motherhood and Black mothering. Similar mothering logics exist among other racialized communities. We mother in the service of our community. We mother in the service of justice. And we mother in the service of liberation. But what does that mean in the context of schooling? The tension that exists between white educators and mothers of color, Black mothers and Indigenous mothers, precludes the establishment of honest, cohesive, and supportive relations, which results in harmful consequences not only for students of color, but also for their communities and their families. And this is why tonight's conversation is so critical. So the questions that I bring forward to our panelists tonight are the following. How does your work challenge the notions of traditional parent engagement? And based on your research, what are the experiences of Black and racialized families in schooling in Ontario? So you must be wondering, when are our panelists going to join the conversation? Without further ado, allow me to introduce our fabulous panelists tonight. Dr. Vidya Shah. Dr. Vidya Shah is an educator, scholar, and activist committed to equity and racial justice in the service of liberatory education. She is an assistant professor. My bad. She's an assistant professor in the Faculty of Education, and her research explores anti-racist approaches to leadership in schools, communities, and school districts. She has worked in the Model Schools for Inner Cities program in the Toronto District School Board, and was an elementary school teacher in the TDSB. Vidya is committed to bridging the gaps between communities, classrooms, school districts, and the academy to reimagine emancipatory possibilities for schooling. Tana Turner. Tana Turner is owner and principal consultant of Turner Consulting Group. She is a researcher, consultant, and advocate for social justice and systems change, and has worked in the field of equity, diversity, and inclusion for over 30 years. In her current role as a consultant, she helps organizations assess their equity, diversity, and inclusion efforts, and supports their ability to hire a more diverse workforce to create a more inclusive working environment and deliver services that meet the needs of a diverse client population. So I'm going to invite Dr. Vidya to present. Dr. Vidya, welcome and thank you so much for being part of this conversation. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Mary Carmen, and thank you for that wonderful introduction for you and from Diana for the tremendous work that you both do in the spaces that you're in. Thank you to Irma and the entire organizing committee behind this, and of course to our ASL interpreters. I'm really happy to be here today in conversation with all of you and in conversation with my dear colleague Tana Turner, who I'm really looking forward to hearing her presentation as well. So I'm going to go ahead and share screen here just to get us started. And I'm sharing this provocatively titled study with all of you. The study titled Lies, Denials, and Cover-Ups. And I'm presenting this research on behalf of Diana Grimaldos as well. I've had the pleasure of working with Diana for the past year, conducting this research, trying to make sense of it, trying to really, think through what this means about schools and schooling. In this research, we interviewed parents who have or are continuing to fight against racism in their schools and school districts. I have such tremendous admiration and gratitude for these parents for sharing their stories with us, for helping us understand how these politics of race and racism play out for them every day. One of the things that I've been thinking about is that schools are often described in society as institutions of care and learning. And this may be very true for some students and families, but it is far from the truth for particular students and particular families, especially those at the margins of power. The 13 Black parents and parents of color in this study speak to stories of harm and grief in their experience advocating for their children. These are explicit stories of anti-Black racism and other forms of racism in Ontario's education system. And what this study makes clear is that these are not simply experiences of cultural differences, of unconscious bias, of unintentional behavior or harm. These are stories of active and intentional harm. And to be very honest, I would not be sharing these findings publicly if I had children in the public school system. When I hear the stories of these parents and the harm that they have endured, if I had children in the system, I probably would not be sharing these findings. And that says a lot. So we begin with two starting points here. The first is the assumption that every institution, including schooling, is built on and upholds white supremacy, colonialism, and other systems of power. The purpose of this study is not to say that all educators are harmful. The purpose of this study is not to point out particular educators or educational leaders. We are sharing this research because what we are trying to expose is the ways in which the system makes possible the kinds of lies and denials and cover-ups that educators engage in to maintain a positive image of the school and the school board. The other starting point that we begin with is that these stories are not new. We are building on histories of parent activism, as Mary Carmen was sharing, of Black mothering and other mothering that has been at the center and the forefront of parent activism. We are simply in another moment of anti-racist parent and community activism in Ontario for the last several years, and this story speaks to those realities. We'll begin with just a little bit of theory to help make sense of how we are thinking about this. So David Gilborn in 2015 described whiteness as a set of assumptions, beliefs, and practices that place the interests and perspectives of white people at the center of what is considered normal and everyday. Now, that's quite the mouthful. The way I think about this is that when we think about the taken for granted assumptions that we have about parent engagement, when we think about the status quo understandings we have about parent engagement, those are all centered in the assumptions, beliefs, and practices that place the interests and perspectives of white people at the center. And so thinking about other ways of parenting, other ways of thinking about engagement is something that challenges this notion of whiteness. A little bit more theory. In 1993, Cheryl Harris termed the coin whiteness as property. And what she says is that whiteness as property refers not only to physical objects, such as land or physical property that we can own, but really to anything to which a person attaches value. Property becomes value, what is valued and valuable. And in the context of education, Gloria Ladson-Billings and William Tate speak about whiteness as property in terms of the direct and indirect benefits of access and opportunity to property owners. And they outline a number of ways in which this happens. So the first is the rights of disposition. And this speaks to the ways in which students are rewarded for conforming to perceived white norms, and the ways in which they are punished for expressing cultural practices that differ from those white norms. So what that means is that Black and racialized students that conform to whiteness, that conform to the set of assumptions and behaviors and practices that make the interests of white people normal and everyday, those students that conform to that are less likely to be punished and more likely to be accepted. Although, as we all know, that acceptance can change in an instant. Second is the right to use and enjoyment. And this speaks to the rights to use school property and what the school offers: high quality curriculum, teaching and learning resources. And as Ladson-Billings and Tate explain, those with quote unquote better property are entitled to quote unquote better schools. The third is the right to reputation and status property. And this speaks to the connection between one's reputation and one's property. So in schools, concepts that are related to Blackness, such as urban or multilingualism, are associated with lower reputations, while concepts that are associated with whiteness, such as presence in French immersion programs, gifted programs, specialty programs, are associated with higher reputations. This notion of reputation also protects individual reputations, associating white students and educators with innocence and Black students and parents with presumed guilt. Therefore, a related right is the right to innocence. Now, the right to innocence is particularly important in this study. As some of the participants have named, some educators, some white, some South Asian, were identified by participants as lying, as denying, as covering up facts to protect their reputations and perceived innocence at the expense of Black and racialized students and families. And so finally is the absolute right to exclude, which speaks to practices such as streaming, specialty programs and programs of choice, white flight, and direct and indirect methods of including Black and racialized students from programs that are deemed to have greater desirability. And we know that for parents for whom English is not a first language, parents with accents that are not deemed acceptable, families with one parent, families that are marginalized by poverty, parents with disabilities, 2S LGBTQ+ parents, and of course, Indigenous, Black, and racialized parents. Exclusion is a regular experience in multiple and intersecting ways. And so in this study, we had the pleasure of being in conversation, an ongoing conversation really, with 13 parents that have fought against racism in their school board. All of those parents come from 5 different school boards in Ontario. 11 identify as Black, 1 is Middle Eastern, 1 is Latinx, 1 identifies as a father, and 12 identify as mothers. And so what did we find? What we found is that there's a pattern in sort of the incidents that occur for why the parent felt that they need to advocate for their child in the first place with regards to racism. The majority of the parents said that the school contacted them with a complaint, often in the first week, as early as kindergarten. The complaint was either behavioral or had to do with quote unquote learning difficulties, or both. And they often said that children were continuously punished for minor things. Now, this is not new information. There are a tremendous amount of studies that speak to these patterns. Yet again, we find the same patterns. A quarter of the parents spoke to the incident that prompted their anti-racist advocacy involving their Black child being treated differently than a non-Black child, more likely to be presumed guilty in comparison to another child. And a third of the participants spoke to getting involved, not because of a specific event involving their child, but because of a racist incident in which the school or school board provided an inadequate response or no response. This might take on educators making racist comments. This might be around guidance counselors streaming and blocking children from advancing. These were common patterns that we heard. Again, this is not new. We have heard these types of findings over and over again. Here's what becomes interesting. A pattern emerged in the data following this incident, in which the school would call home or contact the parents and then tell the parents about the perceived faults of the child. In the initial stages, almost all of the parents spoke of not actually believing that this was an incident of racism, and in fact, disciplining their child for misbehaving at school. Several parents spoke to the shame they felt that they were receiving calls from the school because they didn't want to be perceived as a bad parent. One parent explained that she didn't believe the school would lie and had no reason to doubt their assessment because she put all her faith in the school. Another parent explained that schooling back home meant that you implicitly trusted the educators to do well by your children. And it's important to note that parents felt even more shame when they believed that they were the only ones having this experience with their child at school. After a series of events, such as the child pleading with the parents to believe them, or a neighbor or family member explaining to the parent that this incident is part of a much larger pattern of racial injustice, the parent realized that this was not an isolated incident, that this was not just happening to their child, and this was not something that they would stand for. Parents spoke to feelings of guilt for blaming their child initially, and then fatigue of having to constantly defend their children in meetings and emails. Several parents spoke to using the strategy of simply asking questions as a means of holding the school accountable. They asked questions of policies, of structures, of practices. They asked questions about the benchmarks used to assess their child. And they asked questions about how other children were treated in the same incident. A few parents spoke to confronting the school directly and explaining that they were uncomfortable and upset by the blatant racism they were experiencing. And it was at this point, when power and control of both teachers and administrators was questioned, that the act of harm occurs. And so we position this act of harm as a spectrum, thinking about the spectrum of incidents that led to how schools responded to these parents. Educators with less positional power may have used a condescending tone. They may have told Black parents and parents of colors, quote unquote, how to parent. They would reinforce deficit narratives that the problem is with the child and the parent. Educators may not believe parents and the students' experiences of racism, telling them that this is not about race, this incident is not about race, even in brown and Black bodies. Educators and administrators also protected one another from information being shared or from getting a bad reputation. And they often positioned what might be harmful to the child as something that is in the child's best interest. Educational leaders with greater positional power engaged in behaviors such as lying about students and parents, lying to students and parents, covering up information, denying that conversations even happened, hiding information, threatening the parent more or less directly to place their child in a different classroom or face some other negative consequence if they didn't agree with what the school was asking. And some educators withheld information from parents. There was also this practice that parents spoke of being passed off. So the principal would answer an email, then pass it off to the superintendent, then pass it off to the guidance counselor, back to the principal, without anyone really taking responsibility for the situation at hand and tiring out the parent. And of course, this use of formality, whether formal principles or formal practices or the curriculum, became a way to intimidate, confuse, and exclude parents, letting parents know that we are the experts and we know what is best for your child. And then we see a rising of parent activism happening as parents start to build connections between schools, between districts. As parents became more aware of how the school could harm them and their children, they created and joined supportive networks to think through and strategize about what this might mean and what this could look like. And really, when you think about it, they're joining these supportive networks to try to figure out how to protect their children from harm. Many of them got involved in school councils and parent advisory committees, in local governance and larger parent collectives, and in community-based organizations for Black parents and parents of color. But, and this is a really important but, this work has taken a tremendous toll on parents, on Black parents and parents of color. Now, this is not news for any parent that is currently going through this or has gone through this. It takes a toll physically, psychologically, emotionally, and financially. Many parents spoke to cutting their hours or going part-time in order to be able to support their child to be safe at school. Talk about the debt, as Gloria Latson-Billings speaks to, the education debt owed to families, continues to be owed to families for the harm that families experience. And so we really started to question this idea of, what is it that schools are trying to protect? What version of the truth, what stories are schools so desperately trying to protect? And in this study, it becomes clear that education and educators, that the system has positioned them as good and caring and benevolent and innocent. And any parent that upholds that story is protected, and they receive supports for themselves and their children from the institution. And of course, that protection is always precarious. We never know when that protection will end. But a parent that questions or threatens this story, the story of the school being caring and benevolent and innocent, is at risk of harm, and their children are at risk of harm. So the child that misbehaves threatens this version of the truth. The parent that speaks up threatens this version of the truth. The newspaper article that exposes this narrative for what it is challenges this version of the truth. The social media campaign created to hold schools accountable challenges this version of the truth. And teachers that threaten this version of the truth are also harmed and outcasted and blocked from personal advancement. Many of these parents spoke to that as well. However, Black and racialized students and families that do not question this story, at least publicly, still suffer in silence. And so it becomes this place of having to constantly choose between different levels of harm. And there are legitimate threats that are involved here. What do schools and districts have power and control over in relation to students and families? First, they can allow or deny a child's access to learning, quick to label as behavioral or having learning difficulties, or moving a child to a different school or different learning environment because they're not the right fit in that current classroom or school. The flip side of that is preventing children or creating barriers for Black and racialized children from being tested for gifted classes, for joining specialty programs, to be placed in academic streams, or to receive the necessary support to graduate and apply for programs of choice. So places like special education and guidance and graduation requirements become mechanisms by which Black and some racialized students are restricted and contained. Schools also have the power and control to deny a safe learning environment for Black and racialized children. And not just physical safety, but psychological safety of knowing that the adults in the building will protect you. Educators also have the power and control to determine a child's reputation formally in terms of report cards and the child's educational file and official meetings about the child, and also informally in how they talk among each other and how they speak to the parents and the guardians about their children, how they speak to the children themselves. And finally, there's a fear that so many parents have that the school has the power and control to deem them unfit, to remove the child for the parent and place the child in protective services. This fear is legitimized given the disproportionately high rates of Black and Indigenous children in care in Ontario. For many Black parents and parents of color, how and why they engage as parents in schools is so closely connected to the threat of being forcibly separated from their child, similar to examples of forcible family destruction among Indigenous, Black, and racialized families in Canada's history. We see, as Diana and Marie-Carmen named earlier today, the atrocious and devastating legacy of residential schooling, where in Kamloops, BC, the remains of 250 children were found at the Kamloops Indian Residential School. The ongoing legacy of cultural genocide in Canada. And just as I finish up here, on a bit of a different note, the power of collectivizing helps us see that when we as individuals, with our isolated stories, we experience these incidents as shameful, and it keeps us from really reclaiming our rightful place in society and in schools. And when parents come together and when they share their stories in communities, they identify patterns and trends that are happening to many families and have happened to many families. This helps us shift our focus from an individual to a system, and it helps transform shame and guilt into voice and agency. Coming together in this way reminds us that we are not alone, that there are many people that will stand with us and for us by our sides to continue to protect our children. And I say our, not as the collective our, but I'm thinking specifically of nieces and nephews that I have. Parents, parent groups and collectives, community agencies, journalists, and activist scholars can support parents, guardians, and families by sharing stories publicly, reducing the shame and increasing opportunities for connection, for support, for voice, and for agency. And I'll end here on this final note, that until we acknowledge that these practices can be intentional and purposeful, and that they are harmful towards Black and racialized students and families, the actions that we take to disrupt anti-Black racism and other forms of racism simply will not be enough. And until that point, educators that are committing racist acts will continue to be protected in order to protect the story of schools as caring and all-knowing and innocent and benevolent. And students and parents that challenge that narrative will continue to be treated as threats to that story. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Vidya, for that powerful presentation. There's so much I can say, and so much of the findings that you have shared with us tonight resonate with me. But as you said, the threat is legitimate. And as a mother who has children in the school system, I'll be cautious with what I say and what I share. But many of the things you've mentioned resonated with me and my own experience. And I want to start by acknowledging, as you did, recognizing that we are standing on the shoulders of the legacy of the Black mothers who have been doing this work for decades, actually maybe centuries. We could say that it's been centuries, right, that Black mothers have been doing the work of anti-racism and standing for the rights of their communities. So I want to start by going to you spoke about that rewards and punishment paradigm, and it made me think also about the white-black paradigm, right? And how our proximity to whiteness rewards us, and the opposite, right? It always comes with punishment. So the other thing I wanted to say is that another aspect in which your research resonates with my own experience and my previous research on white women teachers and their interactions with racialized mothers is the antagonism that I mentioned at the beginning, right? The antagonism that exists between white teachers. And we know that most white teachers in Ontario, and I think we can say that in North America, are white women. And so this antagonism precludes the establishment of honest and cohesive and supportive relationships, right? And it is interesting also to see that despite the fact that Toronto is one of the most multicultural, one of the most diverse cities in the world, we still continue to see the prevalence of white educators, right? Which is not reflective of the diversity of our student body. Racism in schools is oriented towards securing a future of whiteness, and I am really grateful that you bring whiteness into this conversation. You spoke about how whiteness is normalized, right? And I think about how whiteness is also seen as invisible, right? We see it in the Eurocentric curriculum, right, and how it becomes a norm. We see it in the prevalence of white teachers and administrators and how that also becomes a norm, despite living, like I said, in one of the most multicultural cities in the world. We see it also in the silences and erasures that happen in schools. So I think about how whiteness disguises as neutral and normal, which is what you wrote at the beginning of your conversation. And so then what happens is that white teachers and white administrators hold knowledge while racialized parents hold perspectives, right? And so I think it's really important to recognize that whiteness becoming normal, right? It becomes invisible, right? And so then it becomes so difficult to challenge that and to name it, right? Even naming whiteness is met with resistance. And also to think about how whiteness and white identity become the yardstick to which everything else is problematically measured and referenced to, right? And going back to that, to the parenting, right? And how for racialized parents, especially for Black mothers and Indigenous mothers, right? There is this consistent, being seen as deficit through that deficit lens, right? And like you say, the fear of being, I think you mentioned to be deemed unfit, right? And I think that fear is consistent and is ongoing, and it has an impact. It has an impact on a physical impact, like you mentioned, but also a spiritual impact, right? A feeling of not feeling quite enough, right? A feeling of being told that we are not quite enough. And I think particularly for Black mothers, but also I think about my own engagement with other racialized mothers who are ESL speakers, and you mentioned that as well, right? And I think about how for ESL parents, for ESL mothers who are racialized, we are often seen through a lens of deficit, but also we are often treated in a patronizing way, right? We are seen as not intelligent enough, right? I think about the many times that white mothers have come to me and say, "Oh, you're so articulate," right? Because I'm not supposed to be, right? I'm not supposed to be because I have an accent. So thinking about how, yeah, in my own experience and my own research, I found that the impact of these deficit-based views on non-white mothers, on Black mothers, result in an inability to forge helpful relationships, which are for the ultimate benefit of students, right? However, and you mentioned this in your findings as well, Black and racialized mothers develop a repertoire of resistance strategies, right? And different ways of engaging and different ways of being present. And despite the challenges, right? We see that for racialized mothers, for Black mothers, they continue to find ways to advocate and to be present, even despite the threats, even despite the fears. And particularly for Black mothers, I think there's a history, right? An ongoing history of parent advocacy, mother advocacy. So I think it's really important to acknowledge that. But also thinking about, white motherhood, right? And how when white motherhood is intersects with white womanhood, right, and teaching, right, and I talk about this in my thesis, in my master's research. I talked about how these three identities, right, which are articulated within empire, and they're articulated within a colonial context, right, white womanhood and white motherhood, and motherhood, white motherhood, and teaching, right, and the history, the colonial history of teaching. And thinking about how that impacts the relationship that white teachers can have with Black mothers and with racialized mothers. And then also through that history, how our own mothering, our own racialized mothering, as either as Black mothers or Indigenous mothers or racialized mothers, immigrant mothers, is always seen through that deficit lens, because again, we are compared to that yardstick of white motherhood, right? So the last thing I want to say, because I know that Tana is waiting for, she's our next presenter. I think about how we can continue interrogating these logics of whiteness and how they appear in education, how they appear in classrooms, and how parents, Black parents and racialized parents can continue to find ways to advocate, but in ways that are safe. Because I think what you mentioned is really important to think about how, and we've seen it, right? We've seen it in the past few months. There have been cases of Black mothers. I'm not gonna name names, but I think you and I are familiar with cases of Black mothers who have been in situations of threat, and where the education system has failed them and has failed their families, and this is not new. This is an ongoing pattern. And so I want to leave it here. We will have time for questions. So now I want to invite Tana Turner to present. Tana, the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you so much. Let me just get my slides ready. So as I was listening to Vidya, so much is reflected in the work that I've done. So certainly there will be some commonalities and some overlaps in what we're talking about today. So what I'd like to do is add to the conversation by sharing some of the findings from my work. And there are two key research projects that I've worked on, which is the basis for the information I'm going to share today. And then it'll lead into the resources that I've developed to empower really Black parents and students to navigate the education system. And so the first report is Towards Race Equity in Education. And this we began in 2016 and published the report in 2017. And it was really inspired by someone at a school board outside of Toronto who said that racism is a Toronto issue and doesn't happen in his school district. And in conversations with him as well, I realized how much he dismissed the numerous reports of racism that he heard from parents. And he would repeatedly say, well, that's anecdotal, right? And he'd brush that aside. And regardless of the number of concerns that were raised, the number of stories of racism that were shared, he would continually dismiss them as one-offs and as not an indication of a larger systemic problem. So that really was my inspiration to engage in this research. And what we did was we took the Toronto District School Board data and held workshops with Black students, Black teachers, and Black parents throughout Toronto, Peel, York Region, and Durham Region to ask if they had the same experience and to ask them and engage in them in conversations about what was happening at home that contributed to some of these outcomes and what was happening at school to contribute to those outcomes. And I'll walk you through some of the findings that we heard from that report. And the second one in March, I completed the project working with the York Region District School Board to research, hold consultations in York Region, and to help prepare their dismantling anti-Black racism strategy. And the research report documents some of the literature and the findings from what we heard from the consultations, and certainly they mirrored what we heard from the consultations for Towards Race Equity. And certainly, while these studies focused on Black students and the experience of Black parents, certainly the information is relevant and applicable to all racialized groups. And I also want to say that I'm a product of Ontario's education system from kindergarten through to grade 13. And certainly that helped shape my understanding, seeing the system from the inside out. And certainly I knew that I had to fight the battles on my own because my immigrant parents trusted this school system to do its job. And certainly too, they worked multiple jobs and didn't have the time to engage with the school system. So certainly I graduated from high school, I won't say what year, but many decades ago. And it was really sad to see that the experiences and issues that I had as a child certainly are evident today. So I want to touch on the parent experiences that we heard through those two research projects. And the first certainly is the trust in the education system. A lot of Black and racialized parents bring their families here, quote, for a better life. And certainly from developing countries to flee economic, war, all sorts of issues in their home countries, and believe, number one, the myth of Canada, that we are champions of multiculturalism, of human rights, and certainly believe that myth that, there's equality here, and that they're valued immigrants to this country. And they also believe that they're coming to, a first world country that in some respects has a better education system from the countries that they came from, right? And certainly in a lot of countries, wherever back home is, teachers are respected. They are a valued member of the community, and they're seen as having the best interests of the children at heart. So parents come here believing that the education system will do right by their child. And certainly, depending on what country they come from, they may not necessarily understand how racism works. And the particular type of racism that they experience in Canada and the subtleties of it as well. So that's the one thing that we heard, just around the trust in the system, how they believe that that their child will get a good education. And certainly this reflects what Vidya had touched on. And then we heard also that, you know, there's a lack of understanding of the education system, a lack of understanding of the different, you know, streams, right? Academic, applied, locally developed courses when they reach high school, not necessarily understanding the process for suspensions and expulsions, not understanding IEPs and what they mean for their child, and certainly not understanding who gets to make the decisions for your child, right? And certainly we heard from the students that this lack of understanding really harmed them, and how they needed their parents to advocate for them. So just, you know, speaking of this, one story comes to mind where a child was selecting courses for high school, and went to the guidance counselor for guidance. And before the guidance counselor even knew his name, even looked up his academic record, the guidance counselor started to talk to this young man about applied courses. And so he had to now begin to advocate for himself to take academic courses. And then he had to bring in his parent to advocate for him. And then when he returned to grade 9 in September, he actually found that his courses had been switched. He had been put in applied courses, even though his parent had signed off on academic courses, right? And then the school was giving them the runaround about changing the courses, you know, saying that, well, the classes are full. We can't change them. You can only change them, you know, in the next term. And all of these issues were coming up. So, you know, a lot of stories about how the teachers, how the school administrators really rely on parents not understanding the system in order to perpetuate their racism, in order to cause harm, you know, to children through all sorts of ways. And, you know, the other thing here is around the fear of reprisal for their advocacy. And certainly we heard from parents repeatedly that they hesitate to advocate for their children because they feared the repercussions and the impact that it will have on their child. And we heard this from Black teachers themselves, right? Black teachers who knew how the system worked, who knew what should and shouldn't be happening, who knew the curriculum, you know, but they really had to be careful in how they advocated for their child because of, number one, that it could impact them and their job. And then number two, how it could impact their child. And certainly we heard, you know, as Vidya said, the punishment that parents who you know, engaged the system, who advocated for their child, you know, they faced, you know, children's aid being called, right? CAS calling them as a way of punishing and controlling the parent. You know, other punishments. One parent talked about how their child had special needs and needed some supports in the classroom, and those supports being taken away from the child because the parent was advocating, right? So while certainly the parents spoke about the importance of advocating for their child, the children talked about how they needed their parent to be engaged and understand the system and know what was going on in the classroom and in the school. Certainly, the parents talked about how they really needed to tread carefully so that they didn't cause further harm to come to their child. We heard also about stereotyping, being seen as single parents, being seen as living in poverty as well, and how that had a negative impact on then how the child is seen. So, we heard from even professional women with senior level positions, talked about, professional Black women in senior positions talked about being careful and really being thoughtful in how they spoke to the teacher or principal, how they dressed when they went to the school, to make sure that if they were married, that their wedding ring was visible. And so the teacher knew that they weren't a single parent. Or one woman said that she did not go to the school without her partner because she knew that if the teacher thought that her child came from a single parent household, that then would impact how her child is seen, and then the education her child would get. Certainly criminalization of not just the children, but the parents as well. That parents spoke about how they needed to control their emotions, especially Black parents who show emotions are seen as threatening, right? If they get upset, if they get angry, that then is seen as a threat, and the police would get called, right? And some of them shared how they were given trespass orders, meaning they could not go back on school property, and therefore they couldn't advocate for their child, right? And certainly too, we heard about the pressure to have their children diagnosed as having special needs. Teachers, diagnosing children as needing medication. Teachers diagnosing children as with all sorts of learning difficulties, behavioral issues, and then pushing those children into behavioral classes, special education classes, and out of mainstream classrooms. And this is important, repeatedly, these stories come up, and we heard from one mother who said that, she lives in a community in York region, and was talking to the other Black mothers in the neighborhood. And she said that every Black mother had a story about the teacher saying that their child had special needs and should get an assessment for special needs. We heard from teachers who Black teachers who talked about in certain schools, there would only be a handful of Black boys, but they would all be in behavioral classes or special education classes, right? So certainly that has come up repeatedly as an issue. And I just want to highlight some of the data because certainly to what Vidya touched on around Black and racialized students being pushed out of gifted programs, French immersion programs, IB programs. Certainly that's what we're seeing and hearing as well. And so this data is from high school. It's a little bit old, but it shows that Black students are disproportionately identified as having special education needs. But certainly when we look at the gifted, right, they are less likely to be identified as being gifted. So 0.4% of all Black students in high school in TDSB during at this time were identified as gifted, compared to 4% of white students. Right? And at this time, there were about 5,000 Black students in high school in the Toronto District School Board system. So 0.4% of 5,000 would be 23 students, right? So 23 Black students in gifted programs. And if they were identified at the same rate, there would be 236 Black students in gifted programs, right? So certainly we heard too that the spaces are white, the spaces are racist, and we heard that some students chose to go back to their home school or back into a general classroom because of the racism they were experiencing in the gifted programs. And we heard too from educators around their understanding of what happens in gifted programs. And some Black educators said that in their experience, Black children in gifted programs are targeted, they're over-disciplined as a way of pushing them out of the gifted program and back into the general classroom. Suspensions again, and certainly this comes back to Vidya's point, you know, they don't see Black children as children. And certainly the stats and the stories, even from kindergarten, Black children are over-disciplined. I remember one parent saying that I think the second day of kindergarten, her child was suspended and sent home, right? The second day. And that then started a pattern that continued, right? So certainly, and this chart shows that by the time a Black student graduates from high school, they have been suspended at least once in high school. And certainly we hear from Black children that when they are disciplined for something that other students do, but they're the ones who are pulled out of that group and suspended. They may be in a fight with a white student, and the white student gets taken to the office and cared for, and the Black student is suspended, right? So certainly disproportionate rates of suspension, disproportionately suspended for the same behavior. And even when Black students are enduring racism, racial harassment, racial bullying from white students, and the teachers do nothing, they fail to do anything to interrupt that behavior. And then when the Black child lashes out, either verbally or physically, they're seen as the aggressor and they're suspended. But the underlying reason why they lashed out isn't investigated and isn't addressed. And we also heard that because Black parents trust the system and believe the teachers, and certainly, as Vidya said, don't believe that teachers would lie, don't believe that the principal or vice principal would lie about an incident. They don't challenge the suspension, right? And they believe that the child must have acted up. And then the child then gets punished at home as well as being punished at school, right? So certainly, and even though there are studies that show that suspensions in the early grades does more harm than good, it really doesn't change behavior. And certainly it can really cause bad behavior from children who now internalize that message that they're not good children, right? And there are lots of studies that show that suspensions in the early years does not change behavior, but yet school boards continue with suspending kindergarten children. And just the other chart is around expulsions. And while Black students make up 12% of high school students in this cohort, this shows that Black students, 48% of all suspensions or expulsions were for Black students, right? So certainly dramatically overrepresented among students expelled from school. And the other thing that's interesting that I've heard repeatedly is that parents are now being encouraged to put their child in expulsion programs, right? So rather than formally expelling children, school boards are now asking parents to voluntarily put their children in expulsion programs. So number one, what this does is they don't have to go through that process of expelling a child. So there's no due process for that child. And the second thing is it keeps their stats low. So there are a number of school boards, when you look up how many expulsions, it shows 0, right? It looks good that they're not expelling kids, but certainly they have healthy expulsion programs that are filled with students, and certainly they're made up primarily of Black students. And so all of that research really took me to the point where, recognizing that lack of information was critical to how some of these issues get perpetuated and how racism gets perpetuated and reinforced in school systems. What I did with with Carl James at the Jean Augustine Chair at York University was develop a series of information sheets for parents, right? And certainly this was done to recognize the important role that parents play in their child's education, right? Parents need to be there to advocate for their children from JK. They need to be involved. The teacher needs to see them. Teacher needs to know they're there. Teacher needs to know they talk to their child every day about what happens in the classroom, right? And so, and certainly these resources also help parents understand what they should be doing at each grade level. And certainly the parent's role changes as the child ages. Yep.
In the interest of time, we only have 2 more minutes.
Okay, I'm sorry. And certainly I'll put the link in the chat for these. And certainly it shows things you should do at home, what to watch for, etc. The other thing we've done too is to create a Black student planner, because critical was, how do you put this information in the hands of Black students and Black parents at the time so that they know what the process is for suspension and expulsions, how you should be working with a guidance counselor, what are your rights versus what the guidance counselor can do. And this information is included in the Black student planner, and really to help. And these 2 resources, the information sheets and the Black student planner, really developed just as a way to empower parents and empower students, and certainly to help level that playing field when with the school and certainly with the teachers. I'll wrap it there. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that, Tana. And Vidya, you may come back if you're ready. Thank you so much. I'm sorry I had to cut you off. I know there's so much, and I know that people have a lot of questions about how they can have access to the resources. I found so many parallels in terms of, the work that you've done and the findings of Vidya and Diana's research. I would like to make so many comments. I think about the piece around immigrant parents and how there's that trust, right, for the system, which resonates with what Vidya was saying about this, seeing the education system, seeing educators as benevolent, right, as innocent. So I can see that connection between these 2 pieces. Also, I think about the adultification of Black children, right, which you speak about, and also Vidya touched on. And I think that's so important for educators to identify when they are engaging in this adultification of Black children and how that perpetuates anti-Blackness and harms Black children. I don't want to, I don't want to keep going because I'm so engaged in this, and I can find so many parallels between your work and Vidya's work, but I want to leave some space and some room for questions. So I'm just gonna go to, and thank you everyone for your questions. I don't think we'll have enough time to go over the questions, but I just want to take a couple. So here, there's one about how do parents keep the educator or the teachers engaged and responsible for actions. Reply. So for actions, i.e. share correspondence with others, follow up with education superiors. So I think this question is more about like how can parents and caregivers keep teachers engaged and responsible and accountable for their actions. And it's up to whoever wants to take it. Vidya, if you want to, or Tana, if you want to go first.
How parents can keep educators accountable for their actions. You know what, I think first of all, it's important to develop a relationship with that teacher, right? From day one. If you can't drop off your child at the school and introduce yourself to the teacher, develop a relationship. And that helps, from what we heard, that helps change the perception that the teacher has about your child. And also then when there are issues, they're more likely to hear from you if you've developed a relationship, rather than, you're angry, you're upset, and you go in to talk to the teacher. So that's just one thing that I would say as well. I don't know if Vidya wants to add.
Sure. I'll just add as well, and I think that piece, Tana, is so important about how we start as best as we can in a good way, knowing that we need to be vigilant, but also knowing that it's the child's well-being that is at stake here. And so we really need to start as best as we can in a good way, in good relation, and also recognizing that there will be times when accountability does have to happen, and we do need to think about how to protect children. And so one of the things I would suggest is to begin with questions, and ask questions of practices. There's a fine line, though, between asking questions and having to teach, which is a whole other level of burden for Black and racialized parents. Have to teach the schools about what anti-Black racism is, or what racism is, and how it harms their child. And so this is not, that is not what needs to happen. At the end of the day, it is our responsibility as educators to be holding ourselves to account, to build in practices in unions. I saw one of the questions here about unions, to build practices in school boards, to think about how teachers are being held to account in this way. I would offer to go into any meetings with someone, with a partner, with a neighbor, with somebody maybe that has experienced this. Oftentimes, there's a lot of emotion. I mean, these are your most precious, relations with your children, and you're trying to protect them, and a lot of emotion comes with that. And so, how do we have somebody else that can hear and be a witness to what's happening? If we are overcome with emotion, that we can't actually hear what's happening, right? And so I would say to also, maybe as best as we can, connect with other parents and parent organizations. There, one of the things that was so loud and clear in our research is that there are so many parents that want to help other parents navigate this. They don't want other children to have to go through what their children have gone through, and so seek out you know, even just on Facebook and through WhatsApp groups and on Twitter, seek out groups that are aiming to do this. And as part of this webinar series, we're going to feature some of those groups so that you can see who is out there doing the kind of work that is that you may need access to.
It
Can I
is.
just add one thing?
Go ahead, please, Tana.
Don't be afraid to call the trustee. Right? One thing we learned too is that white parents use their trustees to get what they want in the education system. And the Black parents said, you know, I talked to the teacher and nothing happened, so I didn't do anything else. Or I talked to the principal. And or they take a long time to work up the ladder. White parents go straight to the top.
Mm-hmm.
And that's so, you know, the trustees are elected and they're there to work for you. So know who your trustee is and use them.
And I'm going to ask you a question here, Tana, because
Mhm.
you're trustees. What happens when you trustee as a racialized parents, right? As a
Mhm.
racialized parents, what happens when your trustee does not respond to you in the same way that they will respond to the white parents, right?
Oh yeah, yeah. You know, it's difficult, but because they're elected officials, I can't say all of them, but a lot of them are more likely to respond to you, right? So instead of waiting months, right, dealing with the teacher, dealing with the principal, you know, certainly, and, you know, certainly the trustees, yes, some of them are racist, but, you know, some of them, sometimes too, you can get really effective results from putting pressure on the trustees. And the other thing too is maybe not, the trustees need to know that the community of racialized people have issues. And so maybe not just go as an individual, but connect with community groups, et cetera, that can start putting pressure on the trustees to make change.
That's a good point.
Mhm.
Vidya.
Name one more thing, our comment is that, you know, school boards and schools do everything they can to stay out of media and to stay out
Mhm.
of social media.
Mm.
And what that does is that it erases the experiences of racism that families face. And what it does is it forces families to, if the lines of communication are closed, if there's lying and denying and covering up of information that's happening, what other recourse do families have, do communities have to protect their children than to expose what is happening?
Mm.
And this is the part that is, I don't understand, you know, that school boards spend so much money and energy and attention covering things up, when if it could be just dealt with in the beginning humanely and justly and with compassion, recognizing that what the parent is asking for, this is the ultimate example of parent engagement, to stand up for your child and to put yourself at risk, to put your child at risk, to stand up for your child. It is the ultimate example of parent engagement, not the bake sales, not the pizza days, not the scholastic book fairs. This is the ultimate example of parent engagement.
Mm-hmm.
And if schools can see that, if school boards can see that, and they can recognize that this is actually a parent engaging in the most significant way for their child, then to block that, what you're actually saying is, I don't care about that child. That child is not worthy to me. That child does not have value to me. That is what you are saying. And so instead of forcing parents to have to go to the media and have to go to social media and have to file a human rights complaint and to do all these things that boards are trying desperately to avoid, address the issue.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Absolutely, absolutely. So I'm not going to comment on all of that because I want to go to another question. And we have so many questions, and I'm sorry we're not going to be able to get to all of them. As a Black mother and educator, so much of what you've said has resonated. I have two questions. What measures have the school boards, individual schools, taken to increase opportunities for story sharing amongst Black parents? And my other question relates to the use of Black Students Alliance groups as a way for improving student voice within this system. I know TDSB has begun to create this group. How about other boards? So Whoever wants to take it. Tana, do you want to take it?
Sure. So the first question around school boards, what have they done to increase opportunities for story sharing among Black parents? I'm not necessarily sure that they do. I think a lot of that work comes from Black educator networks who are organizing Black parent engagement events, right? So I would reach out also to the Black educator networks because they are a really good resource. And there are other educator networks for other racialized groups at some boards as well. And you'd find that those groups are really helpful in helping you understand the system and in supporting you and telling you what to do, what to say, who to call to make change as well. And then
In the chat as well. Sorry, Tana, go ahead.
okay, the Black Student Alliance groups, I know York Region has some as well. So there are other schools that, or school boards that have started Black Student Alliances. And certainly if your school board hasn't, there's an opportunity there to start that as well.
Thank you, Tana. And there are lots of comments on the chat. I see that Josette had, hi Josette, she has posted the TDSB has launched the center. Actually, the launching was today, the Center for Excellence, the Center of Excellence for Black Student Achievement. Sorry, Vidya?
I think it's tomorrow.
Oh, it's tomorrow? I thought it was today. Oh, June 1st. Okay, tomorrow. My bad. Sorry, so that's good. I didn't miss it. Because George Day is going to be there. Professor Wan is going to be there. Okay, perfect. Vidya, do you want to add something else to it?
The only other thing that I'll say is that there's a lot of informal groups that are happening amongst parents. There's a lot of WhatsApp connections that are happening, a lot of Facebook connections that are happening. And so while there might not be, and sometimes it's not always safe to have a formal group established. Sometimes you need to have a space where you can just talk and not have to fear being watched, being surveyed, being monitored in some way. And that's also really important too. So the importance of having formalized spaces is necessary, but the importance also of those informal spaces are also necessary.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's so important that we recognize that this work cannot be done individually, right? We need to connect with one another. We need to form alliances and find groups and find ways of communicating, and also thinking about organizing outside of these school governance bodies, right? Which is also another very effective way of creating change. So it is 8:28. Do we have time to take one more question? Are you okay taking one more question and going over maybe a couple of minutes? The one about teacher unions was somehow engaged. So there's a question for Tana. Tana, please let us know how we can access the inclusive school self-assessment for school administrators, and should we connect with your consulting group to access this audit which you have created for administrative teams?
Okay, I'm not sure what the second one is, but certainly the first one on my website, I offer lots of free resources. The Inclusive School Self-Assessment is there. There are, for educators, there are lesson plans on Black history, there are timelines, there's a whole host of free resources there as well. And then links to the reports as well are there. So, sorry, and my website is turnerconsultinggroup.ca. Thank you, Vidya.
Thank you, Vidya.
Yeah. Okay, and I've put the link to the information sheets, the parent information sheets in the chat as well for folks.
Thank you so much, Tana. Vidya, did you want to add something?
I just wanted to add one thing, and we've been speaking a lot tonight about the experiences of Black and racialized parents in schools, and this has been a topic of conversation for many, many, many years. There are many reports that have been written about this. There are many conversations that have been had about this. There are many times that the unpaid and unacknowledged labor of Black and racialized parents, in particular Black mothers, has gone unnoticed. And this is an invitation, a very strong invitation to white parents. Think about the ways in which how you conceive of parent engagement, the ways in which you engage with Black and racialized parents might be contributing to the very findings that we named tonight. When you think of your school council, who is on that council, and how representative is it of the entire school? In what ways are your children being seen as innocent so that a Black child can be seen as guilty? These are relational concepts. And so this is a really strong invitation to white parents that are listening in or that will be listening in to please, this cannot be the burden of Black and racialized parents alone. The burden for Black and racialized parents exists so that your children can be protected. And when your children are being protected, it means that somebody else's children are being harmed. That is how this system works. And so we are asking you to join with us collectively to think through how we can protect all children, how all children can be safe. And this isn't trying to create a barrier between schools and parents. It's saying, schools, think about how you're operating and think about how you can operate differently so that 5 years from now, we're not having a talk like this. 10 years from now, we're not having a talk like this. And instead, we just admit where things have gone wrong and we make a genuine reparations to make things different.
Absolutely. Those are powerful words, Vidya, and I think it's so important to also recognize that relationality that you speak about in terms of, Black students and vis-a-vis white students also applies to mothers, right? That, white motherhood versus Black motherhood, right? And how that idea, exactly how that idea is at the ideal of white motherhood as good motherhood is at the expense of Black motherhood. So we really need to think about that. And we are 2 minutes over time. I just want to ask you if in 30 seconds, or let's say 45 seconds, what message can you say to educators, to white educators, in the way they engage with Black and racialized parents? If you can send a message to them tonight, because I know many of them are watching tonight, what would you say? I know I didn't put this in my annotated agenda.
Dana, do you want to jump in or would you like me to go first?
You know what I would say, and one thing that strikes me is that Ontario is lauded for this great education system, right? People come here and study this wonderful education system we have, but it fails, right? In some respects, it certainly fails Black students, it fails Indigenous students, certainly. And so I would just ask that they, extend the benefits of this great education system to all students, right? To all children, right? We talk about students, we talk about, these are children who are finding their way in the world and the significant impact they have on the direction of their lives. And just to certainly keep that in mind. The benefit to their lives of getting the same education that is offered to white students.
Thank you, Tana. Vidya?
I'll begin by, I'll start where I started my presentation around whiteness. This idea that whiteness is a logic, it's a way of thinking that upholds the system of white supremacy. And so this is an invitation for white teachers to recognize that they have been socialized into whiteness. In fact, all of us have been socialized into whiteness, but especially in white bodies, if you have been socialized into whiteness, that means that you see and perceive the world in particular ways. This isn't about individual shaming or blaming. This is about recognizing that we are part of a system that has been created in such a way to protect the innocence and purity of especially white female teachers. And in doing so, what it does is it must create, there must be something against which that innocence is measured. And so who becomes criminal in order to protect innocence? Who becomes deviant in order to protect that innocence and that purity? Who becomes wrong in order to make a right? These are relational concepts. And so when we look at what's happening in our schools and the children that Tana was saying who are not being served and feel a sense of belonging in the same way, how are we implicitly connected and complicit in that? That in order to protect ourselves, in order to create frames for ourselves that make us be the right one, the pure one, the innocent one, the all-knowing one, the expert, it means that somebody else has to be the opposite. So in shifting that, and in coming from a place of learning and coming from a place of real, genuine accountability, personal accountability, that is, again, part of a larger system, it might help shift how we engage with students and families.
Thank you so much. Thank you both, Tana, Vidya. We could continue, for hours. And I really appreciate everything, all the knowledge that you've brought. I'm really thankful, and I think and I hope that our audience also found pieces that they will be able to integrate in their everyday life as parents or as teachers or as administrators. I want to invite Diana to come, and also I want to just say that our next webinar is on June 14th. And it will be about navigating the education system, breaking barriers to parent engagement. So we'll be talking about how do we break those barriers. And it will be same time, 7 to 8:30. We will be sharing details within the next few days. Again, I want to thank everyone. I want to thank Vidya and Tana, our interpreters, Joanne and Rana. And I want to especially thank our volunteers tonight, and of course, Irma. So if you want to come on camera so that people can see your beautiful faces, Irma, Maria Jose, Brayley, and of course, those who have been helping behind scenes as well, Christina, Fernanda, everyone who has been part of this project. I really want to thank you. Diana, do you want to say any last words?
Solidarity doesn't happen alone. So I'm really grateful, as I say, to be joined by all these wonderful leaders that are really advocating for a better education system, an education system where all belong. So thank you. Thank you for accepting our invitation and being here and have this amazing conversation.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you for being here. Have a wonderful night and see you in 2 weeks. Bye, everyone.